Perfect. Hello, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and thank you, Nicole, for inviting me to speak at the library. I'm Rebecca Beaudet. I'm an educational advocate. I have a background as a special education teacher and behavior analyst, but the advocacy piece is really where my passion lies. I can tell you a whole story of how I got there another time if you want to hear the whole journey, but I want to have lots of time to dive into the IEP process and answer any questions you might have. Some disclaimers. Throughout my presentation, you'll hear me using identity first language, so I'll say autistic learner, ADHDer, wheelchair user. I default to identity first language because it's largely preferred by the disabled community. Of course, there are preferences within the community that may vary, but that's my default. This is an advocacy event. I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. And then lastly, this is a learning journey for all of us. A lot of the things I talk about might not have happened in your experience at the IEP table. That doesn't mean that the providers you were working with were wrong or trying to do something harmful, but everybody's learning all the time. This is just information to help you feel more empowered and share at the IEP table with your team. I do have a link to the right here that says Does Language Matter? That has more information about identity first language if you want to take a deeper dive. So how to prepare for meetings. I have just some general things for any type of special education meeting. And I actually added a few since Nicole printed those, which even though it was today, because I'm constantly thinking of, oh, wait, that would be another helpful thing for preparing. So first, when you are preparing for a meeting, any request that you have is really helpful to be in writing in the form of a letter. I know people are usually more into sending an email, but if it's a letter with your address, the school's address, addressed formally with your written request, that can be a little more impactful in making your needs known, your concerns known. This can also be accompanied with a parent input statement, and that's something I work with families to create. It's a multi-paragraph letter that talks about what are the students' needs from the perspective of the family, what are their strengths, what are goals you hope to see your child work on in the next school year, what services do you think would support those goals, and then I always have parents put a concern section of anything that they would not want implemented with their child, whether it be that you don't want restraint or seclusion practices, you don't want maybe recess taken away as a punishment, anything that kind of goes against what you would want implemented with your child, you can include in that statement as well. Bring materials to take notes, whatever that looks like for you. Whether it's typing them, handwriting them. If you have a support person available to go with you, a partner, a neighbor, a friend, family member, maybe they can take notes for you so you can be really present in the discussion. Advocate for your own accommodations as needed. If there's something in the room that's taking away from your ability to be your best self at the table, if there's like a buzzing fan that's driving you crazy or a blinking light, like let someone in the room know, like, hey, can we turn that light off? It's really distracting, or that computer is buzzing, I'm having a hard time concentrating. You want to be able to be your best self at the table. Submitting a proposed agenda, what this looks like is a few key bullets that you want to make sure are addressed at the meeting, and submitting that to the team ahead of time. Being collaborative and open, we want schools and families to communicate openly in both directions. Parents don't like being surprised at the table, neither do schools. So any time that you can submit ahead of time, here's 3 things I really want to talk about, bullet, bullet, bullet. And then what is the school planning to talk about? And hopefully they would send back a bulleted list too. So everyone's feeling prepared to have an open conversation. Securing any medical diagnosis or independent evaluations ahead of time. Again, no one likes to be surprised. If you have information that would benefit the school team, sharing that ahead of the meeting and not just presenting it right when you get there, because you can't read a whole report on the spot and be prepared to talk about it productively. Securing any medical documentation, especially if you're talking about a meeting related to behavior. if there's any medical documentation that explains how the behavior would manifest, if your learner was recently hospitalized, if they're in any type of therapy, and that's something that might be related, and you're comfortable sharing it with the school team, you want to bring copies ahead of time. Ensure that all team members are invited. When you get a meeting notice from the school, it should list everyone who's been invited to the meeting. If someone's missing, let the team know. Hey, this person got left off the meeting notice. I really would like them to be included, just to make sure that all the key players are there. Familiarizing yourself with disability categories and any evaluations required. So this is when you get to the actual evaluation process. And I'll dive deeper in another slide what this really means, but there are specific evaluations required for each suspected disability. And it's helpful when you know what those evaluations kind of look like. And if you don't, being able to have that conversation with the team, like, what does that evaluation look like? Is it a checklist? Are you observing the student? Are they sitting down and taking a test? Familiarizing yourself with how the student is or isn't found eligible in the special ed process. And then any reports that the school provides ahead of time, reviewing those, highlighting parts that you might have questions about. And then if you're talking about a placement, your child maybe is going to be in a classroom outside of the public school. If that's up for discussion, asking about scheduling visits at other programs and tours so you can see what that would look like for your learner. And then after the meeting, there's always debrief and follow-up. Very rarely is special ed a one and done meeting, it's ever evolving. So securing copies of the written prior notice and meeting minutes, those are typically sent from the case manager shortly after the meeting, a couple of days usually. Looking to schedule another meeting if that's applicable, whether it's the next step in the special ed process or there was unanswered questions. Sometimes meetings only last about an hour and you had maybe a couple more questions and you need a second meeting. Reviewing any documents you get. It is your right as the parent or guardian for 14 days to review anything before signing it. I always encourage families to use those 14 days. Proofread everything, make sure that what you heard in the meeting is what's on the document, and if it's not, checking in with the school and saying, hey, I heard this, it says this, did I misunderstand? Can we amend and add that sentence? We want everyone to be comfortable with the document. And scheduling a second meeting if there's still questions or concerns before you sign. Talked about scheduling site visits, following up with a written statement of understanding. You can send a follow-up email after to the team. Thanks so much for meeting. These are the actionable items that I understood from the meeting. Can we meet in X amount of weeks to check in about progress? So those are general preparation. Now we're going to dive more into the various types of special ed meetings. So there's the disposition of referral, evaluation planning, eligibility determination, discharge summary, IEP and placement, progress, and manifestation. And these names sometimes vary slightly district to district, so if you're not sure the purpose of the meeting, you can always ask for clarification. Typically, it would say the type on that meeting invitation, but again, if the name throws you off, you can always ask for clarification. So in a referral meeting, this would be the first step of the special ed process. So a parent, a teacher, a related service provider in the school, someone is having educational concerns about a learner, and they're coming forth to the team with a referral. So at this referral meeting, you are sharing the current concerns related to the learner as a whole. It could be academic, it could be executive functioning, it could be social emotional, behavioral. Any data that's been collected so far would be shared at this meeting. This is where those input statements that you submit ahead of time can be really helpful of what you've seen. Like, hey, my child has been absent 5 days in a row from anxiety. They're becoming behind on their homework. I'm seeing this, and a teacher might say, hey, I've seen this in the classroom, like kind of comparing the data And then talking about any previously implemented interventions. Sometimes the referral meeting does not lead to a next step in special ed. It might be, hey, we have these interventions that are kind of in the middle. It's called RTI, response to intervention. So there's 3 tiers in that model. Tier 1 is what all students get. So every student in the school, what's available to them. Tier 2 is kind of those small group, a little bit of supplemental remediation activities where it's not special ed, but it's extra support. Sometimes that might be from a reading specialist. There might be like a math tutor that comes in. And then guidance groups are often a tier 2 intervention. So we'll talk about what's been tried already. Has it worked? Has it not worked? And then see if there needs to be a request for an evaluation for special education. So if the team is in agreement to move forward with evaluations, the next step would be an evaluation planning meeting. Sometimes that happens right on the spot. It's not always a separate meeting. Sometimes they just go right into, yeah, it sounds like evaluations make sense. Let's look at what areas of disability we suspect and what evaluations would answer what we need to know about this student. Parental rights around a referral meeting. Your referrals to the team, if you put in writing that you're referring your child to special education, the team has to meet within 15 days to talk about your referral. A meeting notice telling an agreed upon date and time to meet should be provided to you with 10 days notice so that you can be available for the meeting. You can always waive that too if you agreed over the phone, like, oh, there's an opening tomorrow. Yep, I can come into the meeting tomorrow. There'll be a box for you to check off that says, I wasn't given 10 days notice, but I'm okay with that. And then a written prior notice is a document you receive after the meeting. And the reason it's called written prior notice, it's written and it's given to you prior to asking for your signature for a decision. So the written prior notice is a summary of everything talked about at the meeting. It will say what the district proposed and any ideas they rejected, and then reasons and data for the proposals and rejections. And then a myth around referral, unfortunately I've heard this perpetuated many, many times, that a student has to be failing in order to be referred to special ed and to be evaluated. And there's no law around that, there's no regulation around that. It's simply not true. So it doesn't have to always do with grades. It could be, that social emotional piece, executive functioning. It could be an excess of school absences. There's lots of reasons that a student might be referred. I just covered some of these, but I listed out lots of different skills that might be a barrier for a learner that you might discuss during a referral meeting. I think the only one that I didn't mention, motor skills and adaptive and daily living skills. So really anything that's impacting them educationally. And I challenge all of us to look at that pretty holistically, because special ed is, does the disability impact education, not academics? And I think the two get confused because academics is not the entire educational experience. It's all of these things. So we really have to look at it holistically. After referral, we talked about during that same meeting, you might dive into evaluation planning. Could be scheduled that you meet again. Typically, I've seen them happen right at the same time because they have that 15-day window for the referral. During the evaluation planning, you're going to talk about what is the suspected area of disability. And I have another slide about that. So we'll dive deeper about the different disability categories. The possible next steps, if we are determining that we're going into an evaluation, the types of evaluations would be proposed by the team with parent or guardian consent and signature. They have 60 days to complete those evaluations once they've received your signed permission. And once that 60 days is up, the evaluations have been completed, you've received copies of the reports, and the team has met to go over the results of the reports. And then a myth, again, students can't be evaluated if they have good grades, good attendance, good behavior. You have to look at every piece. So the disability categories are in bold here. And the bullets underneath are the required evaluations in the state of New Hampshire for each of those suspected disabilities. So as a team, you've looked at the data during the referral, you've talked about your observations, and or maybe there's a medical diagnosis, and you've determined, okay, it seems like this student has an educational disability for other health impairment or for autism, whatever it may be. So those bulleted evaluations underneath are the minimum that have to be completed to determine if that student is eligible or not. On the next slide, I'll talk about kind of additional evaluations that can happen. Often schools and families will recommend additional evaluations besides the required ones. So some of the additional ones that are helpful to consider is looking at AAC. So if the student communicates in another means other than mouth words, vocal speech, it might be helpful to have a specialist come in and see, like, is there another way we can support this student's communication? Assistive technology, is there something that we should be looking at, like for mobility, for accessing writing, for accessing reading? There's so many great low and high tech things we can do to support learners. So having a full evaluation in that area can be helpful. Executive functioning, these are usually completed in the form of a checklist with a school psychologist. That can be helpful to look at things such as time management, planning and prioritizing, social and emotional regulation, goal persistence. And then sensory is typically completed as a checklist as well. If your learner is old enough and able to do a self-rating scale, I highly recommend advocating for that. As a teacher or a parent, like if the student can put their own input in there, that's amazing. There's so many times where the adults, we don't give kids a chance to say what they know about themselves, and when we give them the chance to say it, they have all these great strategies like, whoa, we could try that. That would really help you. Thanks for letting me know. And it is always interesting to see like how the student perceives a difficulty or strength versus how a teacher does or how a parent does. I didn't say this in the meeting preparation piece, but when you do that parent input statement, if your student, if your child can be part of that statement, they can do a student input statement too, and letting their teachers, their specialists know like their strengths from their perspective, the barriers from their perspective, what goals might be meaningful and helpful for them. So all the evaluations have happened. We're getting close to the 60 days, and now we're meeting to determine eligibility. Families will have received all of the reports 5 days prior to the meeting, so you can review and highlight and get your questions written down. Just like the other previous meetings, you would have at least 10-day notice to the meeting date and time. After the meeting, you'd be provided that written prior notice summarizing any actions proposed or rejected. And at the eligibility meeting, the purpose is to say, does the student have a disability and require that specialized instruction and related services? So that's going to lead to an IEP. Maybe they have a disability, but they don't require instruction. Schools are not necessarily arguing that a student does or doesn't have a disability. That myth at the bottom, a student can have a medical disability, it does not mean they're automatically eligible for special ed at school. And that, I think, can be kind of confusing because the disability has to impact them educationally in the school setting. So the team could say, yes, they do have a disability, we agree with you, but it's not impacting in the education setting. So that's that second possibility that could happen at the eligibility meeting. And then the third option, they're not disabled and don't qualify for special ed. A discharge summary meeting would happen once you've already been in the IEP process for a year, 3 years, 5 years, etc. The student has made a lot of progress. They've met all of their goals. We're thinking, like, hey, we can start pulling back on some of the supports. They wouldn't be discharged without an evaluation. So that is the myth that I have on the bottom there. If we're feeling like we're getting close to discharge, either the parents are feeling that way or someone at the school is feeling that way, we're going to look at those evaluations again. Evaluations have to happen minimally every 3 years, but they might happen sooner if the students made a ton of progress and we really want to see, like, hey, they might not need this support anymore. Let's get some new data and look at that. And again, we'd have those steps that come out of it of, are they still eligible? Are they not eligible? The IEP and the placement. So there's an initial IEP when the student's first found eligible, and then there's a new one at least once annually. And the purpose of this meeting is to talk about the present levels, the measurable goals, strengths and needs of the student, any accommodations or modifications that they might require to access learning, and then the services and the placement decisions. Possible next step, as I said, it's at least once annually. So families can request and schools can request a progress meeting at any time to go over any of the goals, to make an amendment, to add or take something away from the IEP. The rights around this are the same. You would have a meeting notice. If any decisions were made at the meeting or rejected, that would be written in the written prior notice. And then the two common myths I see most around IEPs is that parents can't see the draft before the IEP meeting. They absolutely can. Parents have right to their child's educational record, and the IEP is part of the record. Some schools choose to write it collaboratively at the table. I've only seen that once, though. I've typically seen it, parents give input, school gives input, they come with a draft, and then you edit it together. So if there is a draft, families should really have an opportunity to look at it, just like the school team has had an opportunity to look at it. The other myth being that parents can't tour a placement because of confidentiality. There's ways around that. They could tour before or after hours. They could meet with the staff. They could see like a virtual tour and just make sure like students aren't in camera shot. It's awfully hard to consent to a placement if you've never seen it. It's really not informed consent. Those progress meetings, again, it's not a formal part of special ed, but they can be called by any team member at any time. And at those meetings, you'd be doing some check-ins, looking at the data, seeing if any amendments are needed, sharing updates. Manifestation meetings. These meetings happen around behavioral concerns. So if a student who already has an IEP has had any disciplinary actions done at school that have led to removal of school or removal from the classroom for 10 or more days in the school year, you would want to call a manifestation meeting to look at, are those behaviors related to their disability? And if they are, how are we going to meet their needs differently so that they're not pulled out of school, they're not sent to the office, they're not in school suspension. And some of the possible next steps that could come from that, if it's determined, yes, these behaviors are related to the student's disability, there might be some more testing done from a behavior analyst or the school psychologist called a functional behavior assessment. We might look at reviewing or modifying the student's behavior plan. This might look like adding a different goal, service, or accommodation to the IEP. And it might open up a discussion about a placement change. Like if the needs can't be met in the public home school, is there somewhere else that could better meet the needs? Now I want to spend some time diving deeper into the IEP document, because I would guess that many people who are watching this presentation are somewhere in the special ed process or are thinking about it or support families in the special ed process. So now I want to dive into probably one of the most important documents in special ed is the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. So the parts of the IEP, and each district, these might be in a different order depending on the software they use to write the IEP, but you'll see all of these areas. They just might be a different order than I have listed here. But there'll be a cover page, a strengths section, Needs section, consideration of special factors, accommodations and modifications, justification for non-participation, state and district-wide assessments, goals, services, extended school year, and placement. On the cover page, this includes general demographics, the student's name, their age, address, what categories they were eligible for special ed, that whole list that we saw of the different educational disabilities, those would be listed. They may have a primary, secondary, some even have a tertiary, a third disability. The school information is on there, parent and guardian contact info. Anyone on the team, when you're reviewing that cover page, you want to just be checking, like, is all the demographic information up to date? Do those disability categories match what was determined at the evaluations? And again, none of these errors done maliciously, but I've seen like, oops, we reversed the primary and secondary disability by mistake. Like, just making sure everything matches, checking the start and end dates of an IEP, and sometimes they might need to be moved up. For example, schools have been really wonderful about big transitions like elementary to middle school or middle school to high school. Like, hey, it really makes more sense if we do the IEP because we've known this student for 3 years and this new team will only know them a month and then have to write an IEP. Like, that's kind of tricky for everybody. So you might decide to move the meeting forward or backward. The school could recommend that, the family could recommend that. If a student's moving like to another town, sometimes it's helpful for the team to meet before that so the new district gets up-to-date information. Same with the 3-year reevaluation date. That will be right on the cover page, and sometimes that might get moved sooner than 3 years for some of those same reasons. All right, the strengths section. I love the strengths section of the IEP. I mean, it really is a deficit-driven document, which is difficult, I think, for everybody at the table. It's hard to say and to hear things about a student or your own child that you love. It's hard to hear the stuff that's difficult for them, the things that they can't do yet. So I really like to bulk up this section with schools and families. I like to add in the students' special interests, like what really brings them joy. That's going to help them access things that maybe are a little harder. Like, how can we incorporate those interests? How do they learn best, like their learning style? Do they have favorite subjects and topics? How do they demonstrate their knowledge best? Do they like giving presentations? Do they like making videos or writing something? Do they like group work? What skills are they really good at? What's something they recently mastered so we can celebrate that at the table? I think that it's easy to forget that the small things can be the big things for a lot of the families we work with. Like, we really want to highlight skills that are recently mastered and celebrate all of them. How does that learner communicate best? Talking about this could be their vocal speech. Do they like to have written input? Do they have an AAC device? Do they do a lot of non-vocal gestures? And then what supports their regulation? So we all know when we're dysregulated, we're not our best selves. It's the same for our learners. The needs section is typically broken into 3 areas: academic, developmental, and functional. And so these 3 sections are looking at what are the next steps for this child? What can they do when we offer the support through the IEP? Usually in this section, there's the justification if they would benefit from a paraeducator or rehabilitative assistance. And then it also, this section would justify if they need specialized instruction in any areas or other related services and therapies. Consideration of special factors. This is a series of yes/no questions that the team answers together. So there's a question about, does the student's behavior impede their learning or that of others? Do they have limited English proficiency? Do they have communication needs? Are they blind or visually impaired? Do they need assistive technology or devices? And do they have medical, sensory, or physical impairments? And if you answer yes to any of these, there's kind of a choose your own adventure. If yes, this might be in the IEP. And some of the examples are on here when we look at accommodations on the right-hand side here. So if we answered yes to that communication needs, you might see something about like an AAC device. They might have an American Sign Language interpreter. They might have speech and language services. If we answered yes to behavior, they might have consultation from a behavior support staff. They might have a behavior plan. So be thinking about, if there's a yes, how are we going to support that area of need? And then in the IEP, often that support looks like accommodations and modifications. The difference. Accommodations, those don't change the assignment, but it's like a tool to complete the same assignment as someone else. So it might be that you're changing the presentation format. Maybe instead of presenting to the class, they're allowed to present one-to-one with the teacher. So it's still the same assignment, they still have to present, but they might need a different way to do that. It could be that the test setting is different. Maybe they go to the guidance office to take their test. Still the same test, but they need a quiet workspace. Versus a modification, you're actually doing a substantial change to the content, to the curriculum. For example, if a student was in 6th grade and they're working with a special educator on 3rd grade content, they'd have a modified curriculum. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I've just listed some ideas for accommodations in various areas: communication, visual, routines and predictability, regulation, academic tools. And I have the added caveat that the goal should not be to fade services. That is something that I've seen a lot, like, oh, we have to get them independent. All of us in this room, all of us at the IEP table, use tools. I think that the important part is, can they use the tool by themselves? Like, we don't want a one-on-one hovering over a kid until they're 22. We don't want that. We want them to have autonomy and to feel proud and to be able to make choices. But we all use tools, so the goal isn't to fade tools. Maybe it's to fade people. Maybe it's to fade prompts to tell them to get their tool. But it shouldn't be to take their tools away. And I like to use the example at the table: who used the calculator on their phone today? Who used the GPS on their phone this week? Like, we all use tools. So why would we expect kids to never use tools? So that's just something that I often talk about at the table. Like, it's not a goal to fade the accommodations. It's a goal to teach them to use the accommodation on their own. Justification for non-participation. These are 3 questions that are in the IEP. Will the child be removed from the general education classroom at any time? This should match the services page. So if it says your student is getting reading instruction in the special ed room 3 days a week, the answer is going to be yes. They're removed from the general ed classroom, and that should match the services. Will the student participate with non-disabled peers in extracurricular and non-academic activities? Yes or no? And will the student be placed for any part of their day outside of his or her local education agency homeschool? So will they be out of their local public school for any part of their day? Whether it's, they might have like a hybrid program where they're in the school half the day and then they go to like an ABA center half the day. They might be a student that gets some home instruction because of medical complexities. So again, this should match the other parts of the IEP. It should match the placement, it should match the services. State and district-wide assessments. These will have multiple sections within the IEP. One section being, does the student need any accommodations, taking those tests? Will they need an alternative assessment? So that's one of those modifications. And does there need to be a discussion around opting out altogether? This, I think, is a very rare case. That data can be helpful and important, but for some students, it's really more harmful if there's an anxiety piece and it's really like damaging their ability to be at school and their mental health. Like, maybe we need to talk about, it doesn't make sense for them to take this particular test. Can we get the same information another way? Extended school year services. it's helpful to know how that's determined. A big myth that I've heard around extended school year services is, oh, we only offer that to X disability. We only offer it to these type of students. The regulations say that it cannot be limited to any particular disability category, and it can't be one type, one amount, and one duration for all kids. It's individualized, just like the rest of their education program. So if, as a teacher or a parent, you hear someone at the table say that, we don't want to embarrass anyone or call someone out, but that really should be a discussion of, hey, that's not okay. It's not limited to a specific type of kid. There is specific criteria of how we determine extended school year services. So the student might be eligible if there's been a lack of progress towards their IEP goals or general curriculum. It could be that they're having an emerging skill or breakthrough opportunity, so they're like just about to meet their goal, and if you don't work on it over the summer, you're gonna kind of lose that steam. The train's gonna interfering behaviors, if that change up of routine and that unpredictability is gonna change that behavior data trending upward, they might need extended school year. The nature and severity of the disability, they have like OT, PT, speech, guidance, mental health, nursing services, if they really need to access that all year round, that could be a reason. Special factors is exactly what it sounds like. It's a reason outside of any of those that the team talks about. And then regression and recoupment. So if in previous years you look at the data and over summer or winter break or spring break, the student's skills dip, that might warrant extended school year services. I'm going to go back one. Thoughts to consider with ESY, even if a student is eligible, it still might not be the best decision. And you want to make that as a whole team. Really consider like where's the program taking place. If it's a different setting than the learner's used to and the program is so short, that might be more stressful than helpful. Same with who's teaching it. If it's all new staff they've never seen, like is that going to be dysregulating? Is the school day so short that they're on the bus longer? I've seen kids are on the bus longer than their ESY program. Will they be with familiar peers? Will they be with peers at all? Those are all things you want to consider in addition to those 6 data points. Transition services. This would be, it's in every IEP, but it's typically blank until around the student's 14th birthday, but it must be in effect by their 16th birthday. And this area is talking about transition from school to like community and adulthood services. So you want to start planning that a few years before they're graduating. And this section includes information about the instruction they're going to receive, any employment goals they may have, community experiences, related services, daily living, vocational assessments. This is updated annually. What a student has for goals post-high school is probably going to change from 16 to 18. And if they're in school till their 22nd birthday, as some students with IEPs are, it's likely going to change from 16 to 22. You have a lot of growth there. We want to make sure that these goals are appropriate and measurable. They're harder to measure. I'm not faulting anyone there. Like when you're making goals around college prep or prep for employment, like they're hard goals to write and they're hard goals to track. But we want to make sure we can measure them so that if something's not working, we can adjust it. We want it to be age appropriate regardless of the student's disability. Like really think about their dignity and what's going to give them a positive experience post-high school. And the courses of study, are those really designed to help them reach their goals? Include the student input as much as possible. It's hard. There's some complex learners where it's hard to get that information. We have to think outside of the box sometimes how to know what their goals are if they can't quite tell us yet. The annual goals section. I think this is really the meat of the IEP because good goals is met with good instruction and then good progress. The goals need to be meaningful. I think on both ends, I've seen goals not be meaningful for a student or in the eyes of the parents, but as a teacher, I've reflected back on some goals I've written, and I'm like, that's a really boring goal. I didn't want to teach it, so why would a kid want to learn it? We have to be really creative. We want it to be meaningful. Is it important to our learner? So again, thinking of this really holistically, like thinking about communication, thinking about motor, thinking about their executive functioning, how they participate in the school environment, academics, those accommodations that we talked about, I like writing those right into the goals. So then it's not confusing to anyone, like what tools do they have to meet this goal? What tools should I be prompting them and then hoping that they use on their own after I model that? How often and what method will progress be shared? How am I going to tell the student if they're making progress? The parent? How am I going to tell my colleagues? And then what curriculums and teaching methods will be used? That doesn't necessarily need to be written into the goal, because you might change curriculums partway through because you're like, hey, data is showing this isn't working. We need to do something different. But it should be a discussion. If someone were to ask what curriculum is being used, we should be able to answer that, even if it's not written right into the goal. That's kind of a side note for families when you're looking at goals. Some of the questions you can ask, like, what does that direct instruction look like? Where does it take place? Who's going to teach it? How many other students will be with my child? And then I have some sample goals here. Again, I'm really big on teaching tools, so I have a lot of tools incorporated into the goals. Self-advocacy, executive functioning, all of those things that feed into academics. You can't access learning if you're not regulated and you don't feel safe. If you can't organize yourself, you're not going to be able to show what you really know. So I have a couple sample goals here. Happy to dive into them more in the Q&A if you want, or have questions about other goals you've seen or written. The services section of the IEP has a couple different sections. Has the special education services. This is typically where paraeducator, speech therapy, and specialized instruction is listed. And then in related services has occupational therapy, speech sometimes is listed there, physical therapy, behavior therapy, counseling, any AAC instruction if they have a device that they use for communication. The supplementary aids and services, this might be looking at like transportation. Like, do they need a specialized vehicle to get to school? It might even be for field trips. I've had interesting conversations with families where like they don't need it in here for this regular school day because maybe their parent brings them to and from school. But then it comes to a field trip and it's like, oh, how are they going to get to the field trip? The big bus is sensory nightmare. The big bus doesn't maybe have like the wheelchair ramp that they need. So sometimes this section might not be every day to and from school. It could be thinking about transportation for accessibility for field trips. And then support for personnel. This could include consultations and training for other staff. It could also be those progress meetings between the family and the school. In some special cases, I've seen also chances for school and an outpatient provider to collaborate in that support for personnel. Then the very end of the IEP, it's actually technically a separate document, even though it's part of the same document when you get the whole packet, but the placement is technically a separate decision. So everything we've just covered up until placement is one signature from families. That you agree to the goals, the accommodations, the services, or that you disagree or you partially agree. And then separately, we talk about placement. So where is all of that going to take place? Is it going to be in the local public school? Is it going to be in a charter school? Is it going to be an out-of-district placement, a residential facility? Is it going to be home instruction? This is determined at least once a year. The placement should be in the least restrictive environment. So where is that student going to access things most similarly to their peers? there's a continuum of placement that typically we go through. We should not jump around too much. There are, of course, special circumstances, but you typically wouldn't go from public school to, okay, now you're at an institution. Like, there's a lot of steps in between that we can look at. Like, are we in the general ed class with push-in services? Are we in the general ed class with some pull-out in a special ed classroom? Are we in a self-contained special ed classroom, a day school? Like, there is a continuum, and we want it to be a data-informed decision and not jump to the most extreme. We want the student to have access to as close to what their peers have access to as possible, where they're still making progress and having a free, appropriate public education. Ask to observe different programs. If placement is on the table outside of the public school, ask what the options are. Go with a trusted member of the school team and tour with them. Ask them, like, what questions should I be asking if you're not sure? And then this should match that participation, non-justification question back at the beginning of if the student will be leaving their home school at all. So if we said yes here, the placement is going to match. I have some additional resources here just to look up more about laws, to have more IEP support. Again, this is not legal advice, but I want people to kind of know what their rights are. I want them to feel empowered, whether you're a parent or you're someone supporting parents. I want everyone to feel good at the IEP meeting. It should not be a war. It's not a fight. We're all on the same team for the child. I want it to be collaborative. So there's some resources here, Office for Civil Rights. This has a lot of good information about 504 plans if your student has a 504 and not an IEP, because it is a separate process. Rights law, you can look up a lot of different case studies from different states. Be careful, not everything there is accurate, because parents can post on it, and parents don't necessarily have special ed law degrees. They might, but they might not. So just take it with a grain of salt, but there's sometimes there's some really creative solutions to barriers that can help us think outside the box. Parent Information Center, New Hampshire has a Parent Information Center. They have a lot of free online courses about the special ed process. They also have a lot of like forums where parents can go and talk to one another and support one another. It's free resources. And then the New Hampshire Procedural Safeguards. This is where, on the previous slides where it said, what are your parental rights at each type of meeting? That's where that's pulled from. This is a list of all of your rights if you're the parent or guardian at the special ed table. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and again, thank Nicole for inviting me to speak at the library. And now I'll open up the floor for questions.